If the Netflix series The Crown has taught us anything, it's that when it comes to love, the British monarchy is often doomed to fail. The history buffs among us will know that as far back as monarchies have existed, marriage has existed in a realm outside of that of the common person. Marriages have been used to secure political alliances, bring peace between nations, and continue bloodlines. Let's take a look at some royal matrimonies that were anything but blessed and holy. Caroline of Brunswick and King George IV. This first tumultuous marriage takes us all the way back to 1700s Britain. King George III's son, George IV, found himself in serious debt despite being the heir to the throne, as his father refused to bail him out. In order to increase his allowance from Parliament, he would have to marry a suitable bride. George had already tried to marry before, to a lady named Maria Fitzherbert. The two were longtime companions and contracted a marriage between. However, it was deemed invalid under English civil law because it wasn't approved by the king. In 1794, George was engaged to Caroline of Brunswick without the two meeting. This would later be considered a bad move, as it turned out. There were no two people in the world less suited to each other. During their wedding ceremony, according to reports, George was incredibly intoxicated and unimpressed with his bride. He commented that she was unattractive and unhygienic, and Caroline wasn't too impressed by her new husband either. Their relationship did not improve as time passed. Thankfully, they were able to conceive an heir, Princess Charlotte. She was their only legitimate child, but her birth did nothing for her parents' relationship. If anything, it made things worse. The day after the birth of his daughter, George wrote a new will. In it, he left all his worldly goods to, and we quote, Maria Fitzherbert, my wife. He left only 1 shilling to Caroline. With his various exploits being reported in the media, George was vilified by the public, and Caroline became more popular by comparison. Many saw her as the wronged wife and cheered for her whenever she made a public appearance. George appealed to Caroline and begged her for a separation, to which she obliged. They were already living separately, so this changed very little about their lives. However, this now meant they were free to do as they pleased and were only tied by their vows of matrimony. Caroline's actions following their separation were controversial for the time. She moved to a new residence and began adopting children living in poverty and fostering them to higher-ranking members of society. After adopting a 3-month-old boy, she was put under investigation after her neighbor claimed the boy was really Caroline's illegitimate son. She was found not guilty. By 1815, Caroline had settled at a villa in Italy and allegedly found love in a man she originally hired to be her servant, Bartolomeo Pergami. However, in 1817, tragedy struck. Princess Charlotte died suddenly after giving birth to a stillborn son. Caroline only heard the news as a courier was passing her estate to send news of Charlotte's death to the Pope and thought to inform her. Over the next 3 years, her father-in-law descended further into madness before eventually passing away after a lengthy battle with dementia. With the prospect of her legal husband being crowned king, she returned to England. Caroline arrived at her husband's coronation on July 19, 1821, but was turned away at the door. Reportedly, after she was made to return to her carriage, the crowds booed her as she rode away. That night, she became extremely ill and died 3 weeks later. She was buried in her native home of Brunswick. Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones. One of the more controversial members of the royal family, it's well known that Princess Margaret didn't have the easiest life, despite being born into the very definition of privilege. After suffering the loss of her father and having to end her engagement to Peter Townsend, Margaret was known to be a heavy smoker and drinker, behaving more like a socialite than a princess. However, there was hope that would all change when she met Tony Armstrong Jones, a photographer, in 1958. The details of their romance were kept private until they became engaged a year later. Margaret's previous engagement had been highly publicized, and the media was eager to seek out similarities between her new fiancé and Peter Townsend. While Tony was well liked by the royal family, and the two seemed happy in their first few years of marriage, an obvious rift had begun to form after their daughter Sarah was born. The issue was that the couple had very similar personalities. They were used to being the center of attention, and having to share the spotlight didn't seem to sit well with either of them. They'd have explosive arguments that were rumored to turn physical, and before long, the affair started. Tony was said to have had multiple affairs during his marriage to Margaret, and this devastated her. However, she wasn't exactly faithful either. Towards the end of their marriage, she had an affair with Robbie Llewellyn, a landscaper who was over 15 years her junior. It was also reported that Tony would leave horrible, insulting notes around the house for Margaret to find. They would usually be a crude observation of her appearance, or simply say, "I hate you." It's fair to say their relationship was rocky at best, and yet they somehow managed to make their marriage last for 18 years. The princess and Tony officially divorced in 1978. Margaret never remarried, but Tony went on to marry his second wife later that same year. King Henry VIII. When we hear the name Henry VIII, most of us think of his 6 disastrous marriages. As the King of England, it was important to Henry that he had a male heir to pass on the line of succession. His quest for a son was inflicted on the lives of 6 women, 3 of whom died during their marriages to him. Since we already know he was the king of failed romances, we'll focus on one of his more notorious relationships, his marriage to Anne Boleyn. Having failed to provide Henry with a son, he sought a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in favor of marrying Anne Boleyn. This resulted in the separation of the Church of England from Rome, as the Pope refused to grant Henry an annulment. The two married when Anne was in her 20s and Henry was 42. The marriage only lasted 3 years and, as we all know, resulted in Anne's beheading. She was tried and found guilty of treason and adultery, but it's thought these claims may have been fabricated by Thomas Cromwell. Henry's attentions had turned to one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Like Catherine, Anne had only given Henry a daughter, and the two hadn't managed to have a living son. It was rumored the reason for her miscarriages was due to an unnatural conception. As Henry lost interest in her, there became fewer opportunities for them to try and have a son. Knowing her life could be at stake if they didn't have a male heir, it's believed that Anne turned to the one man left she could trust, her own brother. No official evidence was brought forward that proved Anne had been anything but faithful to the king, but the word of those close to Henry was enough to sway the vote at Anne's trial. She was put to death and buried on the same day. Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour the following day. Prince Charles and Princess Diana. Would it be a video about cursed royal marriage if we didn't touch on Charles and Diana? We now know that this union was doomed from the start because, in Diana's words, there were 3 people involved in this marriage. It was well known that Charles was in love with Camilla Parker Bowles, who was the opposite of Diana and therefore the opposite of what the royal family wanted in a future Queen of England. The two would eventually marry in 2005, following his divorce and Diana's death more than a decade before. But how did we get here? Under pressure to find a suitable bride, Charles met Diana Spencer when he was actually dating her sister Sarah. At the time, Diana was 16 and Charles was 29. 3 years later, Diana was invited to Balmoral Castle, the family's residence in Scotland, where she impressed Charles' parents and grandmother. He proposed to her in February 1981, and they married that July. Already, things were rocky. Diana was reportedly very lonely living in Buckingham Palace, and their lack of common interests, as well as their age difference, put a strain on the relationship. During her pregnancy with Prince William, Diana threw herself down a staircase in an attempt to end her own life, but thankfully both she and William survived. It's also known that she suffered from an eating disorder, which worsened as time went on. After a few years, the marriage began to break down, and Charles was seeing Camilla again. At the same time, Diana was having an affair with a man named James Hewitt. It's been speculated that he is Prince Harry's biological father. Diana and Charles formally separated in 1992, but would stay legally married for a further 3 years. After her shocking interview with Martin Bashir in 1995, the Queen recommended Charles and Diana should divorce. In the interview, Diana spoke of her unhappiness in her marriage and divulged scandalous details. These included details of her and Charles's affairs, as well as her own mental illness that had caused her to harm herself. Diana passed away the following year in Paris after a traffic collision that also took the life of her then-boyfriend, Dodi Fayed, and driver, Henry Paul. Charles, along with Diana's sisters, flew to France shortly after to accompany her body back to Britain for her funeral. What do you think of these cursed marriages? With this new generation of British monarchs, will they be able to change the tides when it comes to love? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.